Okay, this is an exceedingly challenging reading. Do your best with it, and I'll do my best to try to explain it. In a nutshell, what Kenneth Burke is saying is that technological transformations have altered our perceptions of art and have changed our tastes. Uh, all right, let's get to it. The seeming breach between form and subject matter, between technique and psychology, which has taken place in the last century, is the result, it seems to me, of scientific criteria being unconsciously introduced into matters of purely aesthetic judgment. So science and scientific standards have moved into the realm of artistic judgment. Burke continues, he says, the flourishing of science has been so vigorous, so strong, that we have not yet had time to make a spiritual readjustment adequate to the changes in our resources of material and knowledge. So, because of science and its alteration of our environment, our preferences in art have changed. So, think about like recorded music and how you always hear sort of perfect professional pitch and tuning and stuff without any mistakes. And so like if you go see live music, it might strike you as weird because things are there's rhythmic errors as well as pitch errors, and it hasn't been mopped up scientifically in the sound lab, which is what we get on the radio. Burke asserts there are disorders of the social system which are caused solely by our undigested wealth, the basic disorder being perhaps the phenomenon of overproduction. To remedy this, instead of having all workers employed on half time, we have half working full time and the other half idle, so that whereas overproduction could be the greatest reward of applied science, it has been up to now the most menacing condition modern civilization has had to face. And so I mean, to wrap your head around that, you could think about how like the the internet and the .com phenomena has created all these billionaires, and that's a function of science and how that why that has changed the labor market with like artificial intelligence and robotics and that kind of stuff, and it really changes what it means to be a person. Burke asserts, it would be absurd to suppose that such social disorders would not be paralleled by disorders of culture and taste, especially since science is so pronouncedly a spiritual factor, so that we are, owing to the sudden wealth science has thrown upon us, all nouveau riches, the newly rich, in matters of culture, and most poignantly or significantly in that field where lack of native firmness is most readily exposed in matters of aesthetic judgment, artistic judgment. One of the most striking derangements of taste which science has temporarily thrown upon us involves the understanding of psychology and art. I mean, remember, psychology is a pretty new science. Freud is really, he's like that late 19th, early 20th century especially I think really Freud is much more in the last 100 years where we've had a science of the mind. So psychology has become a body of information, which is precisely what psychology and science should be or must be. And similarly, in art, we tend to look for psychology as the purveying or offering of information. Thus, the great influx of information has led the artist also to lay his emphasis on the giving of information, right? He's kind of paralleling psychology, with the result that art tends more and more to substitute the psychology of the hero, the subject, for the psychology of the audience. Well, what does this mean? It means that more and more art does what the audience wants instead of what would be a kind of greater form or more eloquent narrative. So, for example, if it were up to the audience, Romeo and Juliet would wake up, kiss and live happily ever after, right? But that wouldn't be true to the tragic form. All right, Bert continues. Under such an attitude, where form is preserved, it is preserved as an annex, a luxury, or as some feel a downright affectation, kind of like a glossy pretense. It remains, though sluggish like the human appendix, for occasional demands are still made upon it, but its true vigor is gone, since it is no longer organically required. Now here's Burke's proposition. He says the hypertrophy or exaggeration, right? Hypertrophic would be like a giant bodybuilder or something like that, exaggerated, as opposed to atrophy, which is, weakness. It's like if you don't use your muscles, they atrophy. So he says the hypertrophy of the psychology of information is accompanied by the corresponding atrophy of the psychology of form. And so, like, what he means by that is, when there's more and more information to dissect, the form itself kind of fades and withers. Burke asserts, in information, the matter is intrinsically interesting, and by intrinsically interesting, I do not necessarily mean intrinsically valuable, as witness the intrinsic interest of backyard gossip or the most casual newspaper items. In art, at least the art of the great ages, Aeschylus, Shakespeare, Racine, right? These classical geniuses. The matter is interesting by means of an extrinsic use, of function. And he's going to talk about eloquence next, but I want to just focus on this paragraph briefly. This idea, right, I think this explains like daytime talk shows and Entertainment Tonight, and why like CNN and Fox News begin more and more to mere gossip. Right, it's the sensational is what matters in the psychology of information, and not these hard hitting news stories, the old school Dan Rather, Walter Cronkite type stuff. Right. All right. Burke continues. The methods of maintaining interest which are most natural to the psychology of information, as it is applied to works of pure art, are surprise and suspense. Right? You think about that. It's always what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? And so you could think about all the goofy plot twists and programs like CSI, where, they're really playing with psychology and trying to shock. The whole thing is a kind of ambush of information that exploits surprise and suspense. Burke continues, he says, the method most natural to the psychology of form is eloquence, right? Very different than the psychology of information, right? Eloquence is the method most natural to the psychology of form. For this reason, the great ages of Aeschylus, Shakespeare, and Racine, dealing as they did with material which was more or less a matter of common knowledge, so that the broad outlines of the plot were well known in advance, while it is the broad outlines which are usually exploited to secure surprise and suspense, developed formal excellence or eloquence as the basis of appeal in their work. So you think about that. I mean, what's so funny about the great works of art is you already know what's going to happen. There is no doubt about the ending. The conclusion is already preordained, and you know it, but you still will go see Romeo and Juliet. I saw a college production of it not too long ago, and I cried like a baby, even though I'd seen it half a dozen times before. It's not surprise and suspense which manifests the psychology of form. It's eloquence, the greatness of the work of art itself. Burke continues, he says, the drama, more than any other form, must never lose sight of its audience. Here the failure to satisfy the proper requirements is most disastrous. And since certain contemporary work is successful, it follows that rudimentary laws of composition are being complied with. The distinction is one of intensity rather than of kind. The contemporary audience hears the lines of a Player novel with the same equipment as it brings to reading the lines of its daily newspaper. It is content to have facts placed before it in some more or less adequate sequence. Right? And I'll only say, we don't even read a newspaper anymore. We surf the internet, and we, as Nick Carr has said, we want to move through stuff really fast, and we don't want to ponder. It's not about deep reflection anymore for us. It's just about novel information. All right, Burke continues. Eloquence is the minimizing of this interest in fact per se, so that the more or less adequate sequence of the presentation must be relied onto a much greater extent. Thus, those elements of surprise and suspense are subtilized, right, made kind of the minute details carried down into the writing of a line or sentence until in all its smallest details the work bristles with disclosures, contrast, restatements with a difference, ellipses, images, aphorisms, volume, sound values, in short, all that complex wealth of minutiae, the little stuff, which in their line for line aspect we call style, and in their broader outlines we call form, right? So I'm not going to spend too much time on it. It's only to say that eloquence in the work of art, right, and this notion which emanates from the psychology of form has to do with caring about all the little details to make the work beautiful and powerful. Suspense is the concern over the possible outcomes of some specific detail of plot rather than for general qualities, right? It's the anxiety of wondering what the heck is going to happen next. That's what suspense when dealing with a work of art is. But to return, we have made three terms synonymous, right? They mean the same thing: form, psychology, and eloquence. And eloquence thereby becomes the essence of art, while pity, tragedy, sweetness, humor, in short, all the emotions which we experience in life proper as non-artists, are simply the material on which the eloquence may feed, right? So that becomes the stuff of art. Eloquence is simply the end of art, and thus its essence. Even the poorest art is eloquent, but in a poor way, with less intensity, until this aspect is obscured by others fattening upon its leanness. Eloquence is not showiness, it is rather the result of that desire in the artist to make a work perfect by adapting it in every minute detail to the racial appetites. And so when he says racial appetites, he's not meaning black, white, he's saying the human race. And really, it's this idea of shaping and molding and transforming and cultivating the work of art until the artist thinks it's as close to possibly perfect as it ever could be. Burke says the distinction between the psychology of information and the psychology of form involves a definition of aesthetic or artistic truth. It is here precisely to combat the deflection which the strength of science has caused to our tastes that we must examine the essential breach or separation between scientific and artistic truth. Truth in art is not the discovery of facts, not an addition to human knowledge in the scientific sense of the word. It is rather the exercise of human propriety or appropriateness, the formulation of symbols which rigidify our sense of poise and rhythm. Artistic truth is the externalization of taste. And then he concludes, the symbol is perhaps most overwhelming in its effect when the artist's and the reader's pattern of experience closely coincide. And so this idea of identification,